family dog won't stop howling at a closed room. When the owner finally opens it, they uncover a secret that chills them to the bone. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Sarah's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as she pulled up to 47 Blackwood Avenue. The Victorian house loomed before her, its weathered facade a testament to decades of history. The moving truck had already departed, leaving their boxes stacked haphazardly on the wraparound porch. In the back seat, 5-year-old Lucas clutched his dinosaur plushie, while Max, their yellow Labrador, pressed his nose against the window. "Well, this is it," Sarah announced, more to steady herself than to inform her companions. The house's peaked roof and ornate trim work cast long shadows in the late afternoon light. She had purchased the property at a surprisingly low price, and now, facing its imposing presence, she understood why. Max was the first to react. As soon as Sarah opened the car door, he bounded out, his usual playful demeanor replaced by an unusual alertness. His tail, typically wagging with enthusiasm, remained still as he surveyed the property. Sarah helped Lucas out of his car seat, watching as her son's eyes widened at the sight of their new home. "It's big, Mummy," Lucas whispered, still clutching his dinosaur. Sarah squeezed his hand reassuringly, though she couldn't shake off her own unease. They made their way up the creaking porch steps. The real estate agent had left the keys under the doormat, as promised. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the heavy wooden door. The hinges groaned, releasing a rush of stale air that carried the musty scent of aged wood and neglect. Inside, their footsteps echoed against hardwood floors. The entrance hall branched off into several rooms, each shrouded in shadows despite the daylight outside. Max moved cautiously, his nails clicking against the floor as he explored. Everything seemed normal until they reached the kitchen. The dog stopped abruptly, his attention fixed on a door tucked into the corner. Unlike the other entrances in the house, this one was secured with a heavy padlock. Sarah consulted her mental floor plan. This must be the basement door. As she contemplated it, Max let out his first howl. The sound startled both Sarah and Lucas. It wasn't the playful bark she was accustomed to, but a deep, mournful cry that seemed to resonate through the entire house. Lucas pressed closer to her leg. "Max, quiet," Sarah commanded, but the dog continued, his eyes never leaving the basement door. She tugged on his collar, trying to direct him toward the living room where they could start unpacking. Max resisted, planting his feet firmly on the floor. As evening approached, Sarah focused on creating some semblance of normalcy. She set up Lucas's bedroom first, arranging his favorite toys and making his bed with the dinosaur-printed sheets he loved. Throughout it all, Max's intermittent howling provided an unsettling soundtrack to their unpacking. The dog's behavior grew increasingly concerning. He refused to leave the kitchen, maintaining his vigil by the basement door. When Sarah tried to feed him, he wouldn't touch his food. His howls became more frequent as darkness fell, each one sending shivers down Sarah's spine. After tucking Lucas into bed, Sarah returned downstairs. The house creaked and settled around her, each sound amplified in the nighttime quiet. Max's silhouette was visible in the kitchen doorway, still stationed by the basement door. As she approached, he turned to look at her, and Sarah froze. In the dim light, his eyes seemed to hold an almost human intelligence, a knowing that transcended his canine nature. The basement door stood before her, its padlock gleaming dully in the darkness. Sarah's fingers brushed against the cold metal, and Max's howling intensified. Something about that door, about this house, felt wrong. Yet here they were, their savings invested, their old life left behind. They had to make this work. Sarah withdrew her hand from the lock, and Max's howls subsided to a whimper. She'd deal with the basement tomorrow, in daylight. But as she headed upstairs to her bedroom, Max's cries followed her, his laments echoing through the house like a warning she couldn't quite understand. 3 nights of Max's incessant howling had left Sarah exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The basement door's padlock had become an obsession, its presence taunting her during every trip to the kitchen. She couldn't keep ignoring it, especially not with Max's behavior growing more erratic by the day. That morning, after sending Lucas off to his first day at the new preschool, Sarah stood before the basement door. Max sat beside her, unusually quiet but alert. The key ring from the real estate agent contained several unmarked keys. Her hands trembled as she tried each one in the padlock. The 5th key clicked. The lock fell open with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. Max's ears perked up, but he remained silent. Sarah pulled the door open slowly, wincing at the loud creak of rusted hinges. A draft of cold air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The wooden stairs disappeared into darkness. Sarah's finger found the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, the bulb would be burned out. She retrieved her phone and activated its flashlight, casting a harsh beam into the gloom. Max followed close behind as she descended, his breath warm against her calf. The basement was larger than she expected. Her phone's light revealed stone foundation walls and a dirt floor in some areas. Cobwebs draped from exposed beams, and abandoned furniture created looming shadows. But it was the trunk that caught her attention. A large, Victorian-era piece positioned directly beneath the single dirty window, as if waiting for her. Unlike everything else in the basement, the trunk showed signs of recent disturbance. The layer of dust on its lid was broken by finger marks. Sarah's heart pounded as she approached. Max whined softly but didn't howl. The trunk wasn't locked. Inside, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, she found a leather-bound book. Its pages were yellowed but intact, the handwriting inside clear and elegant. A name was written on the first page: property of Eliza Blackwood, 1892. Sarah settled onto an old chair, the diary in her lap. As she began to read, Max pressed against her legs, his usual agitation replaced by an eerie stillness. "My dearest diary," the first entry began. "Father has finally agreed to let me keep my own journal. He says a lady must have proper outlets for her thoughts, especially those that cannot be spoken aloud. If only he knew the true nature of what I must keep silent." The entries that followed painted a picture of Eliza's life, a young woman trapped by the social constraints of her time, harboring a love that would have scandalized her family. Sarah found herself drawn into Eliza's world, recognition stirring in her chest at the familiar pain of forbidden feelings. But it was the entry dated October 31st, 1892, that made her blood run cold. "They cannot keep us apart forever. Thomas has promised to meet me in the basement tonight. We will finally be together, away from judging eyes. My heart soars at the thought, though something about his manner today left me unsettled." Max suddenly growled, a low rumble that made Sarah jump. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop. As she turned the page, a photograph slipped out, a formal portrait of a young woman in Victorian dress. Eliza's eyes stared back at her, holding the same haunted look Sarah had seen in her own mirror that morning. The final entries became increasingly frantic, filled with mentions of betrayal, jealousy, and revenge. The last page contained only 5 words: "God forgive me for tonight's sins." Sarah closed the diary, her hands shaking. Max began pacing, his nails clicking against the concrete floor. Above them, a floorboard creaked, though Sarah knew the house was empty. The diary felt heavy in her hands, weighted with more than just paper and leather. That's when Max started howling again, but this time, Sarah could have sworn she heard something else beneath his cries. A woman's voice, distant and filled with sorrow, calling out a name she couldn't quite make out. Clutching the diary to her chest, Sarah hurried up the stairs, Max close behind. But even after she locked the basement door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them up. something that had been waiting almost a century for someone to find Eliza's story. Sleep no longer provided escape for Sarah. Ever since finding Eliza's diary, her nights had become a torment of vivid dreams. In these nightmares, she walked the halls of the house as it existed in 1892. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Tonight's dream felt different, more real. Sarah found herself in the basement, wearing a high-necked dress that wasn't her own. The space was clean, organized, nothing like the cluttered cellar she'd explored. Candles provided dim illumination, casting dancing shadows on stone walls. She heard footsteps above, then the creak of the basement door. "Thomas." The voice that came from her throat wasn't her own. "Is that you?" Instead of an answer, she heard Max's howl, but it wasn't coming from a dog. The sound emanated from everywhere and nowhere, a warning that pierced through time itself. The basement door slammed shut. Footsteps descended the stairs, heavy and deliberate. The candlelight flickered, shadows stretching like grasping hands. Sarah jolted awake, gasping. Her bedroom was cold despite the summer heat outside. Max stood at her bedside, rigid and alert, staring at her bedroom door. His eyes reflected the dim light from her digital clock, giving them an otherworldly glow. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, but Max didn't relax. Instead, he turned his head toward the hallway and let out a low growl. Sarah checked her phone. 3:47 a.m. The exact time Eliza had recorded in her final diary entry. The coincidence sent a chill down her spine. She slipped out of bed, following Max's gaze. The dog moved to the doorway, his behavior shifting from alert to agitated. Rather than his usual mournful howls, he paced back and forth, whining urgently. The hallway outside was dark, but Sarah could have sworn she saw movement, a flutter of fabric, perhaps, or a shadow where no shadow should be. Max led her toward Lucas's room. Her son slept peacefully, clutching his dinosaur plush, but something felt off. The air around his bed was unnaturally cold, and a faint scent of lavender, Eliza's favorite perfume, according to her diary, hung in the air. Max positioned himself between Lucas's bed and the corner of the room, his posture protective. Sarah approached the corner, drawn by an inexplicable urge. In the dim light from the hallway, she noticed something she'd missed during their move. A small door, barely 3 feet high, built into the wall. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle. Max's whining intensified, but he didn't try to stop her. The door opened with surprising ease, revealing a narrow shaft that seemed to lead down to the basement. A draft carried up the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decay. Something white caught her eye, a piece of paper wedged between the boards of the shaft. Sarah retrieved it carefully. It was a note, written in the same elegant hand as the diary. "Beware the third night of the third month. He comes again, wearing a face of love. The child must not answer when called." Sarah's blood ran cold. Today was the third night since they'd found the diary. And Lucas. He'd mentioned at dinner that someone had been calling his name when he played in the garden. Though Sarah had seen no one there, a sudden thud from downstairs made her jump. Max's hackles rose, but he didn't move from his position by Lucas's bed. Sarah crept to the hallway window that overlooked the front yard. In the moonlight, she saw a figure standing beneath the old oak tree, a man in what appeared to be Victorian-era clothing. As she watched, he turned, looking up directly at her window. His face was handsome, but his eyes were wrong. The figure vanished between one blink and the next. Sarah rushed back to Lucas's room, but her son slept on, unaware. Max had relaxed slightly, though he remained by the bed. The small door in the wall was now firmly shut, though Sarah was certain she'd left it open. When morning came, Sarah found herself questioning her sanity, but 3 things convinced her that night had been real. The note, still clutched in her hand. A single muddy footprint at the bottom of the stairs, too large to be her own. And Max's changed behavior. The dog no longer howled at the basement door. Instead, He took up constant guard duty outside Lucas's room, his eyes always fixed on that small door in the wall. Sarah knew she needed help. The diary, the dreams, the warnings. It was all connected to something darker than she'd imagined. As she made breakfast, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Lucas's sake, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window. For a moment, superimposed over her own image, she saw Eliza's face, mouthing words she couldn't understand. But one thing was clear: time was running out. Sarah found Dr. Thompson's contact information on a worn business card tucked into the local library's occult section. The card simply read paranormal investigations and historical research, followed by a phone number. She'd spent the morning researching the Blackwood family history, finding nothing but dead ends and redacted newspaper articles. With Lucas at school and Max growing more restless by the day, she knew she needed expert help. Dr. Thompson arrived that afternoon in a weathered Volvo filled with equipment. He wasn't what Sarah expected. No dramatic coat or mystical accessories. Just a man in his 60s, wearing khakis and a cardigan, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better days. "The house has quite a reputation," he said, stepping into the foyer. "Though I suspect you've discovered that already." His eyes tracked Max's movements as the dog circled him cautiously. "Interesting. Your Labrador, he's been acting as a sentinel, hasn't he?" Sarah nodded, leading him to the kitchen. It started with the basement, but now she gestured toward the ceiling, indicating Lucas's room above. Dr. Thompson set his briefcase on the kitchen table and began removing instruments, EMF meters, thermal cameras, and what looked like an old tape recorder. Dogs are sensitive to spiritual energy. They often serve as bridges between our world and theirs. "Has he shown any unusual behavior beyond the howling?" Before Sarah could answer, Max's head snapped toward the basement door. The dog's fur bristled, but instead of howling, he released a low, rumbling growl. Dr. Thompson's EMF meter suddenly sparked to life, its display flickering wildly. "Remarkable," he muttered, adjusting dials on his equipment. "The energy readings are off the scale. Mrs. Walker, I believe your house is experiencing what we call a temporal overlap, a moment where past and present intersect." The temperature in the kitchen plummeted. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs of vapor despite the summer heat outside. Dr. Thompson's instruments began beeping erratically, and the lights overhead flickered. "Eliza." "Blackwood," Dr. Thompson said, his voice taking on an authoritative tone. "If you're here, we wish to help." The cold intensified, and Max's growl deepened. "We know about Thomas. We know what happened that night." A high-pitched whine filled the air, like feedback from a microphone. Sarah's ears popped as the pressure in the room changed. The basement door shuddered in its frame. "Mrs. Walker, I need you to listen carefully," Dr. Thompson said, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Your son, he's the same age Thomas's child would have been. I believe that's why Eliza's spirit is drawn to him. She's not trying to harm him, but..." A crash from upstairs cut him off. Max bolted for the stairs, barking frantically. Sarah followed, her heart pounding. They found Lucas's bedroom door locked, though she distinctly remembered leaving it open. Inside, they could hear furniture moving. "Stand back," Dr. Thompson ordered, pulling something from his briefcase. A small leather pouch. He scattered its contents, a mixture of herbs and salt, across the threshold. "Eliza," he called out, "you must release your hold on this family. Your time has passed." The door flew open with explosive force. Lucas's room was in chaos. Toys scattered everywhere, drawers pulled open, his bedsheets twisted into knots. But Lucas wasn't there. "The passageway," Sarah gasped, rushing to the small door in the wall. It stood open, revealing the dark shaft leading to the basement. Dr. Thompson's face went pale. "This is worse than I thought. The house, it's not just haunted, it's a portal. Eliza isn't trapped here, she's being held here, and whatever's holding her." He gripped Sarah's arm. "We need to get to the basement, now. But first, there's something you need to know about Thomas. He wasn't who Eliza thought he was. Historical records show he had a pattern, moving from town to town, targeting wealthy families, particularly ones with. Max's urgent barking from downstairs interrupted him. The dog had somehow gotten to the basement ahead of them. His barks changed to a yelp, then silence. The lights throughout the house went out simultaneously. In the darkness, Sarah heard a child's laugh, not Lucas's, followed by the distinct sound of the basement door slamming shut. "Mrs. Walker," Dr. Thompson whispered, his voice tight with fear. "I should mention that in all my years of research, I've never encountered a spirit with this level of power. Whatever's down there with your son, it's been waiting a very long time for this moment." Sarah reached for her phone's flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. From the basement came the sound of singing, a soft lullaby in a woman's voice, the same melody Sarah had heard in her dreams. But underneath it was another sound, something that made her blood run cold. The scrape of heavy boots on wooden stairs, coming up. Dr. Thompson grabbed her arm again. "Remember this. In 1892, Thomas wasn't the only one who died in that basement." The living room transformed into an improvised chamber as darkness fell. Dr. Thompson worked methodically, arranging candles in a precise circle while consulting a worn leather journal. Sarah paced nearby, her eyes constantly darting to the basement door. Max lay in the doorway between them, his body tense, watching both the basement and the ceiling where Lucas's room was located. "Mrs. Walker," Dr. Thompson said, checking his pocket watch, "we need to begin. The witching hour approaches, and the barrier between worlds grows thinner." He positioned 3 chairs within the circle, one for Sarah, one for himself, and a third, empty chair that made Sarah's skin crawl. The temperature had dropped steadily over the past hour. Their breath fogged in the candlelight as Dr. Thompson removed a silver pendant from his briefcase. "This belonged to a medium who investigated the house in 1893, he explained, placing it on the empty chair. "She disappeared during her investigation, but her pendant was found in the basement." Sarah's hands trembled as she took her seat. "What aren't you telling me about Thomas?" "Thomas Bennett wasn't his real name, Dr. Thompson replied, setting up an ancient voice recorder. "He appeared in several cities between 1885 and 1892, always pursuing wealthy women with family secrets. Eliza wasn't his first target, but she was his last." Before Sarah could respond, the candles flickered violently. Max rose to his feet, hackles raised. A gust of wind swept through the room, though all windows were closed. The voice recorder switched on by itself, emitting static. "Eliza," Dr. Thompson called out, his voice steady. "We're here to help you find peace. Show us what happened that night." The static on the recorder shifted, forming words. He promised. "Love, basement, trap." Suddenly, Max began to convulse. His eyes rolled back, and a sound emerged from his throat. Not a dog's howl, but a woman's scream. Sarah tried to reach for him, but Dr. Thompson held her back. "Don't break the circle," he warned. "The dog is acting as a conduit." The room plunged into total darkness as every candle extinguished simultaneously. In the blackness, a figure materialized in the empty chair. A woman in a Victorian dress, her face a mask of anguish. "Eliza." He took everything. Eliza's voice echoed through Max's body, creating an unsettling harmony of human and canine sounds. "My love, my life, my baby, your baby, your baby." Sarah gasped, pieces clicking into place. "You were pregnant." The temperature dropped further. Frost crystallized on the windows. Eliza's form flickered, her appearance shifting between beautiful young woman and something darker, more horrific. "Thomas wasn't just a con man," Dr. Thompson said grimly. "He was something older, darker. He sought out women like Eliza, women with child, women from bloodlines touched by old magic." The Blackwoods had a history of supernatural connections. Max's body went rigid, then relaxed. When he opened his eyes, they glowed with an unnatural blue light. Words poured from him in Eliza's voice. He wanted my child. Said the blood of both lines would give him power, I thought. I thought he loved me, but in the basement that night, his face changed. He wasn't human. The house began to shake. Pictures fell from walls. From upstairs came the sound of Lucas crying out. My baby, Eliza's spirit wailed. I couldn't let him take my baby. I sealed us all in. The ritual. Used my own blood. Trapped him here. But the price. The price. Sarah stood, breaking the circle. Lucas, what does Thomas want with my son? The spirit of Elisa rose, her form stretching impossibly tall. Your blood, your son's blood, the same as mine. He's been waiting, gathering strength. The third night of the third month, the seal weakens. Dr. Thompson's voice recorder exploded in a shower of sparks. Max collapsed, his body shuddering. The temperature rose suddenly, violently, candles reigniting with flames that reached toward the ceiling. The basement, Eliza's voice came from everywhere at once. He's breaking free. I can't hold him anymore. Tried to warn you. Tried to protect. Through the dog, my love reborn. But now, a deep, masculine laugh echoed through the house. The floor beneath them cracked, a dark liquid seeping up through the hardwood. Dr. Thompson grabbed his briefcase, pulling out a small iron box. Mrs. Walker, he said urgently, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but you must listen. Max isn't just a dog. When Eliza killed herself to seal Thomas in the basement, her lover tried to save her. He failed, but his soul, his dedication, it's been waiting, watching over this house, reborn in your dog's form. And now, the basement door burst open with a sound like thunder. Max leaped to his feet, his form shimmying like a mirage. Where the dog had stood, the translucent figure of a young man in Victorian clothing appeared for just a moment before flickering back to canine form. From the basement came an inhuman roar, and the sound of heavy footsteps ascending. He's here, Eliza's spirit whispered, her form beginning to fade. Save the child. Don't let my sacrifice be in vain. The ritual can be broken, but the price. Her voice disappeared into the growing chaos. Sarah looked at Max, her dog, Eliza's lover, her protector, as his body began to glow with an intense blue light. Dr. Thompson pressed the iron box into her hands. Remember, he said, his voice nearly lost in the supernatural storm surrounding them. Love sealed him in. Only love can destroy him. But this time, the sacrifice must be willing. Dawn found Sarah in the local library's archives, surrounded by century-old documents, while Dr. Thompson made urgent phone calls in the background. They had barely escaped the house as whatever dwelled in the basement broke free. Max had held it back somehow, his glowing form blocking the stairs while they fled. The memory of his transformation still haunted her. The Blackwood genealogy, Sarah muttered, spreading out yellowed papers across the oak table. Her hands trembled as she traced the family lines. Dr. Thompson had insisted they research before returning to face whatever Thomas truly was. The iron box he'd given her sat heavily in her bag, its contents still unknown. Here, Dr. Thompson said, hanging up his phone and pointing to a marriage certificate from 1867. Eliza's mother was a Morton before marriage, and your grandmother's maiden name was Morton, Sarah whispered, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. That's why he wants Lucas. We're not just connected to Eliza, we're her direct descendants. Dr. Thompson pulled out a leather-bound volume titled New England Occult Histories, 1800 to 1900. The book fell open to a well-worn page about the Morton family. The Mortons were known practitioners of protective magic. Their bloodline was considered particularly powerful for binding rituals. Thomas didn't choose Eliza by accident. Sarah's research had revealed darker truths about Thomas Bennett. News articles from different cities showed the same pattern. Wealthy young women found dead in their homes, their unborn children missing, but the articles never connected the deaths, never noticed that a man matching Thomas's description had courted each victim. What is he? Sarah demanded, pushing away a particularly disturbing article about a death in Boston. Dr. Thompson's face grew grave. There are creatures older than humanity, Mrs. Walker. Things that feed on bloodlines of power, growing stronger with each generation they consume. Thomas is what some traditions call a bloodline eater. He takes the form of whatever his victims most desire, but his true nature. The old man shuddered. A librarian approached their table with a box of records from the City Hall archives. Inside, they found the original blueprints for the house. The basement's layout was different from the current structure. A series of ritual circles had been carved into the foundation, hidden beneath the modern flooring. Eliza knew, Sarah realized. Examining the blueprints, she discovered what he was, used her family's power to trap him. But she was pregnant, desperate. The ritual wasn't perfect. No, Dr. Thompson agreed. She bound him with love, her love for her unborn child, her lover's devotion. But such bindings weaken over time. Each generation of your family that lived away from the house weakened it further. When you moved in, I completed the circle, Sarah whispered, brought the bloodline back. But Max, you said he's Eliza's lover reborn. Dr. Thompson opened another book, this one filled with photographs. One showed a young man in Victorian clothing, his eyes bright with devotion. James Morrison. He died trying to save Eliza that night. His last act was a pledge to protect her bloodline through the ages. Somehow, his soul found a way. The lights in the library flickered. Outside, storm clouds gathered unnaturally fast. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Lucas's school. Her son was missing from his classroom. He's taken him to the house. Sarah realized, her heart racing. But why wait? Why not take him last night? Dr. Thompson's face paled as he checked his pocket watch. The lunar cycle. Tonight's a full moon. The same phase as the night Eliza performed her ritual. With Lucas's blood and the power of the cycle, Thomas could break the last of Eliza's binding. Become truly free. Sarah grabbed the iron box from her bag. Tell me what's in here. Tell me how to stop him. The box contains earth from Eliza's grave, mixed with blessed iron shavings and her dried blood. Samples I collected years ago, during my initial investigation, combined with your blood, freely given. It could reinforce her original binding. But Sarah, he gripped her arm. The price would be the same as what Eliza paid. A life for a life. The difference is, you'd have to choose it willingly. Thunder cracked outside. The library's lights went out completely. In the darkness, Sarah felt Max's presence, not physically there, but watching, waiting at the house where her son was held captive by a monster wearing a human face. There's more in the records, Dr. Thompson said quietly, about the night Eliza died. James wasn't just her lover. They had performed a hand-fasting ritual in secret. Their souls were bound. That's why his protection has endured through Max. And that's why he hesitated. Why? What? Why you may have another option. One that could destroy Thomas completely instead of just binding him. But it would require something even more precious than your life. He looked at her meaningfully. It would require you to sacrifice the purest form of love. Max's devotion, his very soul, the accumulated power of 100 years of faithful guardianship. Lightning illuminated the library windows, and in the flash, Sarah saw Max's reflection in the glass. Not the dog, but the young man, James Morrison. His eyes filled with the same limitless love she'd seen in her faithful companion every day. She understood then what she had to do. We're going back to the house, she said, gathering the documents. And this time, we're ending it. For Eliza, for Lucas, for all of them. As they rushed to Dr. Thompson's car, the iron box grew warm in Sarah's bag. Inside, mixed with the grave earth and blood, was the final ingredient they'd discovered in Eliza's diary. A lock of her lover's hair, the physical anchor that had allowed James's soul to return as Max, bound to protect her bloodline through the centuries. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of the old Victorian house, Sarah's heart began to pound with a sense of dread. Lucas was nowhere to be found. She'd been calling his name throughout the house, her voice echoing in the empty rooms. Max, usually calm and observant, had grown frantic, pacing back and forth, his eyes constantly darting toward the basement door. "Lucas, Lucas," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. She felt the walls closing in, the air growing colder and heavier. Max barked urgently, as if trying to convey a message. Sarah's gaze shifted to him, and she saw the same intense look he'd had whenever he stared at the basement. Her heart sank. "Do you know where he is, Max?" she whispered, as if the dog could respond. Max barked again, running toward the basement door, then looking back at her. His behavior left no room for doubt. He was leading her to Lucas. Summoning all her courage, Sarah approached the basement door. Her fingers trembled as she turned the cold, metal doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing the steep staircase that descended into darkness. Max darted down first, his paws thudding softly against the wooden steps, urging her to follow. Sarah took a shaky breath, steeling herself, and followed him down. The air in the basement was frigid, each step down feeling like a descent into another world. She felt as if she was stepping into the past, each footfall echoing louder in the silence. The basement was dim, lit only by a sliver of light from the small, dusty window near the ceiling. She looked around, scanning the shadowy corners, and her gaze landed on a faint, eerie glow from the far side of the room. "Lucas," Sarah called, her voice barely a whisper, filled with equal parts hope and fear. In the dim light, she finally saw him. Lucas was standing perfectly still, his small body bathed in the strange, pale light that emanated from somewhere deep within the basement walls. His eyes were wide, yet unfocused, as if he was staring into a void only he could see. His face bore a look of fear, frozen in a trance-like state. "Lucas." She ran toward him, reaching out to touch him, but a sudden wave of cold pushed her back. Her hand met an invisible barrier, a wall of energy that seemed to pulse with the same strange, unearthly light. Sarah's mind raced, her fear mounting with each second. She could feel an unnatural force, something ancient and powerful, emanating from the very walls around them. Max took a defensive stance, positioning himself between Sarah and Lucas. His hackles rose, and he let out a low, protective growl that reverberated through the basement. It was clear that Max sensed the same presence she did. Eliza's spirit, trapped and tormented, unwilling to let go. In that moment, a whisper filled the air, chilling Sarah to her core. It was a woman's voice, faint yet haunting, echoing off the walls. "He is mine. He belongs here with me." The voice was tinged with sorrow and bitterness, as if weighed down by decades of unresolved pain. "No," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "He's my son. You can't have him." Max barked defiantly, his gaze fixed on the darkness surrounding Lucas. He seemed to sense that the spirit's hold on Lucas was strong, but not unbreakable. Sarah looked down at Max, her loyal companion, feeling a surge of strength from his presence. Whatever Elisa wanted, she would have to fight both of them to take it. A sudden gust of wind swept through the basement, despite the absence of any open windows or doors. It circled around them, making the dim light flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cold intensified, biting at Sarah's skin and making it hard to breathe. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if Eliza were right beside her, her voice filled with desperation. "Let him go," Sarah demanded, her voice breaking through the relentless whisper. "You don't have to stay here. I know your story. I know about the betrayal, the lies, and the pain you suffered. But keeping my son here won't change what happened to you." For a moment, the whisper stopped, leaving only silence. Then, the light around Lucas flickered and dimmed, as if the spirit was hesitating, uncertain. Sarah seized the opportunity, reaching through the invisible barrier, trying to pull Lucas back to her. "Please, Eliza," she pleaded, her voice softer now, infused with empathy. "I understand your pain, but this isn't the way. Let Lucas go. Let us help you find peace." Max barked once more, his tone softer but still protective, as if supporting Sarah's plea. He stepped closer to Lucas, nudging the boy gently with his nose. The barrier between them seemed to weaken, allowing Sarah to finally touch her son's shoulder. The moment she made contact, Lucas blinked, his eyes clearing as he looked up at her, confused and frightened. "Mama," he whispered, clutching her arm. Relief flooded over Sarah as she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. But the atmosphere in the basement remained tense, the cold and darkness still pressing down on them. Before they could leave, the whispering returned, softer this time, filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "I was alone, forgotten, betrayed." The voice trembled with raw emotion, as if reliving the past. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy, understanding that Eliza's torment stemmed not just from betrayal, but from the loneliness and isolation that had trapped her here. "Rest now, Eliza," Sarah whispered, her tone gentle but firm. "You're not alone anymore. We'll remember you. We'll honor your story, but you have to let us go." The cold in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a gentle warmth that filled the basement. The eerie light around Lucas faded entirely, and the barrier melted away. A final, almost inaudible sigh echoed through the space, like a breath of relief. Max relaxed, his stance softening as he looked up at Sarah, his eyes reflecting a calm she hadn't seen since they'd moved in. It was over, or at least Sarah hoped it was. With Lucas safely in her arms and Max at her side, Sarah turned toward the stairs, ready to leave the basement and its secrets behind. As they ascended, she glanced back one last time, catching a fleeting glimpse of a faint, shimmering light, as if Eliza were finally finding her way out of the darkness. As Sarah climbed the stairs, a wave of exhaustion hit her, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on her shoulders. She'd barely reached the top when she heard a faint creak behind her, as if something or someone was still moving in the basement below. She paused, clutching Lucas closer, her heart pounding as she looked down into the darkness. Max, ever vigilant, positioned himself at the top of the stairs, growling softly. His hackles rose again, signaling that whatever presence had been in the basement wasn't entirely gone. Despite the warmth that had filled the basement moments before, a chill crept through the house, the air thickening with a familiar, oppressive energy. The faint, sorrowful whisper of Eliza echoed through the stairwell. "She betrayed me, and now I am bound." The voice was faint but insistent, carrying a pain so deep that it seemed to reverberate through the walls of the old house. "Bound," Sarah whispered to herself, piecing together the fragments of Eliza's story. She'd learned about the betrayal, about the forbidden love Eliza had once shared, but she'd sensed there was more, something left unsaid. Setting Lucas down safely in the hallway, Sarah knelt beside him, instructing him to stay close to Max. "Stay here with Max, okay, sweetie? Mommy has to go back for a moment." Max looked at her, his eyes filled with concern, but he didn't protest. His loyalty and protection for both her and Lucas were unwavering, and he stayed close, watching her intently as she took a step back toward the basement door. She felt drawn to go back, compelled to uncover the truth. With every step down, the oppressive chill returned, clawing at her skin, filling her mind with visions she couldn't explain. Shadows seemed to shift around her, and her own footsteps echoed hollowly in the confined space. At the bottom, she turned toward the far wall, noticing something she hadn't seen before, a small, inconspicuous door hidden behind a stack of old boxes. Summoning her courage, Sarah moved the boxes aside, revealing a weathered lock that had rusted with age. She hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of foreboding, but something within her, a mix of empathy and determination, pushed her to press on. The lock broke easily with a tug, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, hidden passage. It led to a tiny, dimly lit room with cracked walls and a single small window obscured by grime. In the center of the room was a worn, dusty trunk, similar to the one she'd found in the basement earlier. Only this one felt different, heavier with the weight of secrets. Kneeling beside the trunk, she gingerly lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, some faded photographs, and a small, delicate locket. As she sifted through them, a story emerged, piecing together Eliza's tragic past with startling clarity. The letters were love notes exchanged between Eliza and a man named Thomas, recounting their dreams of a future together, a future cut short by betrayal and cruelty. One of the letters caught her eye. It was from Thomas, written in hurried script, a note filled with remorse and regret. He spoke of a forced engagement, of his family pressuring him into an alliance with someone else, a woman of wealth who could secure his family's status. Eliza had been left alone, her heart shattered, and her spirit bound by the bitterness of betrayal and the solitude of her heartbreak. A faint, cold breath touched Sarah's neck, and she turned, half expecting to see someone behind her. The room felt alive with Eliza's sorrow, as if the spirit itself were manifesting, pouring out her pain in waves that Sarah could feel in her bones. "Eliza," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I know your pain, but Thomas's betrayal doesn't have to define you forever. You don't have to stay here, bound to this place." The whisper grew louder, the room trembling slightly as if in response. They took everything, my love, my life, and left me to suffer. No one deserves to suffer alone," Sarah replied, her tone filled with compassion. "But holding on to this pain has trapped you here. Let go, Eliza. You've suffered enough. You deserve peace." Max, who had quietly padded down to the basement and found his way into the hidden room, sat beside Sarah, his presence a calming anchor in the storm of emotions. He looked up at Sarah, then at the locket in her hand, his eyes seeming to convey understanding. "Max is here with me, Eliza," Sarah continued. "He's here to guide you to peace, just as he guided me to you. Please, for both of us, let go of this place, of the sorrow that keeps you here." The air grew still, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt a warmth, a shift, as if Eliza's spirit was hesitating, wavering on the brink of release. The whisper softened, the sorrowful tone replaced by one of acceptance and relief. "Thank you for remembering, for seeing me." Eliza's voice trailed off, fading into silence as the atmosphere lifted, the chill replaced by a gentle warmth that filled the room. Sarah closed the locket and placed it back in the trunk, her hands steady now, feeling a profound sense of closure. She looked at Max, his posture relaxed, his eyes calm and wise. Together, they made their way out of the basement, feeling as though they'd truly left the past behind them. In the hallway, Lucas looked up, smiling with his innocent eyes, reaching out for Sarah's hand. She took it, a comforting weight in her palm, grounding her as they stepped into the light, leaving the shadows of the basement behind. And as they closed the basement door, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza was no longer alone, that her spirit had found the peace it so desperately sought. As Sarah closed the basement door behind her, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over the house. The oppressive weight that had once lingered in every corner seemed to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that was both comforting and strange. Max's behavior, too, had shifted. No longer did he stare anxiously at the basement door or growl at unseen entities. Instead, he sat calmly by Sarah's side, his gaze softened, as if he, too, sensed the finality of what had just taken place. That evening, Sarah tucked Lucas into bed, and for the first time since they had moved in, he drifted off to sleep without waking in the night. She watched him for a moment, brushing a gentle hand over his hair, grateful that the shadow of Eliza's sorrow had finally been lifted. Returning to the living room, she found Max lying near the fireplace, his head resting on his paws. She sank into the couch, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. The entire journey, the discovery of the altar, the visions, the conversations with Eliza's spirit, had been exhausting, but now In the quiet of her living room, Sarah finally felt as though the house was truly theirs. "Thank you, Max," she murmured, her voice breaking the silence. "You helped me find her. I couldn't have done this without you." Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that almost felt human. There was a depth there, an understanding that surpassed what she expected from even the most loyal of dogs. He gave a soft whine and moved closer to her, resting his head on her lap, as if to say, "I was meant to be here for this." As the night deepened, Sarah dozed off, comforted by Max's warm presence by her side. She drifted into a light sleep, her dreams calm for the first time in weeks. But just as she began to sink into deeper rest, she felt a gentle nudge. Blinking her eyes open, she found herself staring into Max's golden eyes, his gaze fixed on her with an urgency she didn't understand. "What is it, boy?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Max stood, padding slowly toward the hallway that led to the basement door. Sarah's heart sank, fearing that perhaps Eliza's spirit hadn't been entirely freed. But this time, Max didn't stop at the basement. Instead, he led her toward the small room she had recently converted into a makeshift office. Inside, he stood by the desk, his gaze shifting to a small drawer Sarah hadn't thought much about. She approached, curious, and opened it. Inside was an old photograph she hadn't noticed before, hidden under some papers. The picture showed a young woman with hauntingly familiar features, standing with a Labrador by her side. "Is this Eliza?" Sarah whispered, realizing with a start that the woman in the photo looked remarkably like herself. But it wasn't just the resemblance that startled her. It was the Labrador at the woman's side, a dog almost identical to Max. Max whined softly, brushing his nose against her leg. The connection suddenly became clear. This wasn't just coincidence. Somehow, in ways she couldn't fully comprehend, Max was linked to Eliza's story, tied to her loss and her spirit's quest for peace. "Eliza's love," she murmured, piecing together the fragments of memory and mystery. "Max wasn't just here to help me. He was here to complete a journey that began long ago." Feeling a deep sense of understanding, Sarah sat down beside Max, placing a hand on his back. The warmth that radiated from him felt different now, charged with something almost otherworldly. In that moment, she heard a faint whisper, like a gentle breeze passing through the room. "Thank you for setting us free." The warmth intensified, filling the room as though sunlight itself had flooded in. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her, sensing Eliza's gratitude and the completion of something unfinished. When she opened her eyes, Max's gaze was still on her, filled with a quiet understanding. He lay down beside her, placing his head on her lap, and for a brief moment, she felt as if they were both bathed in an inexplicable, peaceful glow. The days that followed were filled with a sense of normalcy Sarah hadn't expected. Lucas played freely around the house, and Max no longer showed any signs of unease. The house felt lighter, as if the memories and shadows that had once haunted it were finally laid to rest. But Sarah knew that what she and Max had experienced was something far beyond the ordinary. It was as if the house had wanted them there, had called them to fulfill a purpose neither of them had anticipated. Max remained by her side, his calm and steady presence a reminder of all they had been through together. The Labrador had proven to be much more than a loyal companion. He was a guardian, a bridge to the past, and perhaps even the reincarnation of a love story left unfinished until now. As she watched Max lying peacefully in the sunlight one afternoon, she realized that he was not only her protector, but also a keeper of memories. A gentle soul who had helped her uncover a truth buried in the shadows of time. And as she looked around the house that had once felt so strange, she knew that they had finally made it a home, a place of peace, love, and redemption. Several peaceful weeks passed, and the house had settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah and Lucas had never felt so secure. Max, their ever-loyal Labrador, had finally stopped his midnight vigils. Content to rest by the fireplace or at the foot of Lucas's bed, his role as guardian seemingly complete. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing lunch while Lucas played nearby. Max lay curled up in a patch of sunlight, eyes half closed. She glanced at him, smiling to herself at the tranquility they'd all finally found. But then Max lifted his head, his gaze locking onto her with an intensity that stopped her in her tracks. His golden eyes seemed to glow, brighter than she'd ever seen before. "Max," she whispered, wiping her hands on a towel and moving toward him. As she approached, a strange warmth radiated from him, growing stronger with each step. She knelt beside him, and Max nuzzled her hand, his gaze both familiar and unfathomably deep. Then, in an astonishing transformation, Max began to emit a soft, otherworldly glow. The light intensified, filling the room, and Sarah's heart raced as a sense of déjà vu flooded her. She could feel Eliza's presence once more, as though her spirit had returned to share one last truth. The light swirled around Max, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah felt as if she were looking at something or someone beyond the physical world. A soft voice, barely a whisper, filled her mind. "Love never dies." In that instant, Sarah understood. Max was more than just her loyal pet. Somehow, he was the reincarnation of Eliza's lost love, returned to guard Sarah and Lucas, and to finally bring peace to the home. All this time, Eliza's spirit hadn't been searching for vengeance or resolution alone. She'd been guiding her lost love back to her descendant to keep them safe. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as the realization sank in. Max had been more than a dog. He had been a silent protector, a guardian spirit reborn in the form of her loyal Labrador, sent to complete a mission left unfinished generations ago. Max gave her hand a gentle lick, his gaze filled with an ancient understanding that surpassed any human connection she'd ever felt. The glowing light around him dimmed, fading slowly, leaving only the familiar warmth of her beloved Labrador. "Thank you, Max," Sarah whispered, stroking his head as he curled up beside her, his eyes closing peacefully. She felt his loyalty, his love, a bond transcending both time and life itself. As the days passed, the glow of that unforgettable afternoon never quite left the house. Sarah felt it in the warmth of each sunrise, in the gentle breeze through the windows, and in every glance from Max's wise eyes. The old house no longer seemed haunted, and the memories that had once weighed down its walls now felt like gentle whispers of a love that had stood the test of time. With Max by her side, Sarah knew she was safe, loved, and connected to something eternal. And every now and then, in the quiet of the night, she'd swear she felt Eliza's presence, a reassuring touch, a grateful sigh as if to say, "The circle is complete."